with you, probably not only for this lecture, but for the next number of lectures. One of the legendary personages amongst the Jewish people, that's the chafetz Chaim, Rav Yisroel Meir, Cohen, kagan. Now, due to the fact that the chafetz Chaim is such a legendary personality, many biographies and stories have been written about him, a great many of which are, I wouldn't say not accurate, they're just not true. And that didn't just start in our time when, for various reasons, we find that stories and biographies of great Jews in previous generations are changed or modified or adjusted to meet the standards and the norms that we feel are acceptable today. But even at the time when the chafetz Chaim was dead only a few years, in his lifetime, many bogus stories and events and even viewpoints regarding the world were advanced in his name. That is undoubtedly the price that one has to pay for being the leading Jew of the generation, for living into his 10th decade, for being the author of so many famous and basic works in Jewish life, law, and for being the holy man of the Jewish people. There's a story that's told about a great rabbi that wrote a book on biographies and stories, and it is said that when he came, he wrote it in Israel. And it's said that when he came to Israel, he came with two suitcases, two mizvadot. In one suitcase he had stories, and the other suitcase he had the names of people, and then he matched them. He put it together. Well, there is such a tendency to do it. I can guarantee that everything we say here is accurate, beyond any doubt. I have relied on two main sources. One is a primary source, and one is a secondary source. The primary source is the biography of the chafetz Chaim written by his son. The chafetz Chaim had a son, Cohen, where the whole why was he called Tupko and not kagan, that's part of that, that's 2 lectures from now, we'll find out how that happened, right? But that itself is a story. And he wrote in 1937, the chafetz Chaim died just a few years before that. In 1937, he wrote a short biography of his father, which, for various reasons, is not popular. I don't want to say that my theory about the matter is correct, but it's correct, and that is that the reason it's not popular is because it portrays the chafetz Chaim in a fashion that many people who would like to use the chafetz Chaim would not like to see him portrayed. It shows the chafetz Chaim as a much more astute and vital person. In my opinion, certainly enhances him if such a word can be used regarding the chafetz Chaim. But for various reasons, for instance, the book was published right before the war in 1937, and it was not republished until 1986. Almost 50 years, the book was not republished. You couldn't get the book. And when it was republished in Bnei Brak in Israel. And the people who published it came under severe criticism. Even though they added nothing, they detracted nothing. And this is the story of the chafetz Chaim is written by his son. And in fact, it is to a great extent, it's a remarkable piece of work. The biography part is photostated exactly. Some of the book is reset in new modern type. The parts about his letters and some of the famous epigrams that he mentioned, all of that has been reset. So there, you can't, even though I'm certain that they copied it exactly, but but the part of the biography is an exact photostat of the original type of 1937. So I've used that as the primary source. A secondary source is in the fourth chapter of the great work, Tenuas HaMusar, which is the work on the Musar movement by Rabbi Dov Katz, also from Israel. He has a lengthy biography of the Chafetz Chaim, and I've used that also as a background material and to cull certain facts and to expand on matters that the Chafetz Chaim's son is either cryptic about or ignores. The Chafetz Chaim's son, Rav Yisroel Meir, writes in the book many times, he says, I have a lot to tell you here, but I wouldn't put it in writing publicly. In the first 30 pages of the biography, this phrase appears 15 times. And again, therefore, it's clear to me at least that whatever picture we will have, and hopefully it'll be as clear a picture as possible of the time, you still don't have them. It's still not the story. Still not the real story. But, until they sell the video, I don't know how we're going to ever get the real story. Also, just as a further background to the matter, my father-in-law, should live and be well, spent decades with the Chafetz Chaim. From the time that my father-in-law was a very young child before Bar Mitzvah, when he was an orphan and came to live at the Chafetz Chaim's house, until after he went through the entire First World War with the Chafetz Chaim, when they wandered throughout Lithuania and then White Russia, and then finally to the Ukraine, and then back again to White, all during the Civil War between the Reds and the Whites. And then they wandered back, and they finally crossed the border illegally back into Poland and reestablished the yeshiva in Radin in 1921. So he was with the Chafetz Chaim during that entire period of time. And some of the viewpoints and ideas and even stories that I will relate are firsthand from him. And he always tells me, and this is, I'm going to conclude the introduction with this, but he always tells me, no matter what I tell him about the Chafetz Chaim, he says, "Das is nicht gewesen the Chafetz Chaim." That was not the Chafetz Chaim. So I can tell you in advance that this is not the Chafetz Chaim. But I can't help it, right? We're trying to do the best that we can. My father-in-law said, the famous picture of the Chafetz Chaim that everybody has, that's not him. He said, didn't look like him at all. There's absolutely no resemblance to him. Chafetz Chaim had one legitimate picture taken in his lifetime, and that was for a passport, because he wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael. So he took a picture for a Polish passport. From that too, so passport pictures we know are notorious for their distortion. I mean, nobody ever did a shit up on the basis of a passport picture. Let's put it that way, right? And the other pictures that were taken of him were snapshots that were taken of him surreptitiously, because he never allowed himself to be photographed. And therefore, and then people touched up the photographs, and then they made paintings on the photographs, etc., etc. So my father always tells me that also, any picture that you have, that's not the Chafetz Chaim. Chafetz Chaim was born in 1853 in a small Lithuanian village called Zitel. Chafetz Chaim himself never was when he grew to manhood, never was 5 foot tall. And he was a very, very frail, thin. Those that know him say that they doubt if he weighed 110 pounds. And that he was an unimposing figure, to put it mildly. And all of his life he dressed and conducted himself in an unimposing fashion. And that is really what perhaps contributed to the aura, to the mystique of the man, was the fact that he didn't look the part. He didn't look like the leader of the Jewish people. He didn't look like the greatest Talmudic scholar. He didn't look like the man that everybody quaked in fear in front of. He didn't look like the man that was going to go, as he went many times, to speak directly to the Russian government and later to the Polish government on Jewish matters. He didn't look the part. He wore a small Polish hat with a little beak. He never wore rabbinic clothing. He never held an official title in his life. In the yeshiva where he was not the Rosh Yeshiva. They called it the yeshiva, it was the Chaim yeshiva. And he had no post. He was not the Mashgiach, he was not the Rosh Yeshiva, he didn't say the Shir, he was nothing. And in the town where he lived in Rodden, and he lived there for almost 70 years, he was not the rabbi in town. I knew in Chicago he had the son of the last rabbi of Rodden, who in Chicago was a lawyer. Upstein was his name. And then, so the Rosentown was Rav Kopstein in Rodden at the end, or in the previous time. But I would imagine that would be very difficult for a rabbi to have the chafetz as a balabot. Right? To have him as one of your members. That would give anyone pause. But he is really an exceptional person because of all of these things. He's literally, if there is such a word by us, he's a holy man. Even though he never saw himself as such, and that probably is the primary requisite of being a holy man, is not to think that you're a holy man. And my father always told me that a chafetz used to say, I only do what's written in the book, he said. You know, he said, there are people who are holy, they can do more. He said, my mitzvah struggle just to do what's in the book. I try to do what's in the book. So, the odds, you have to understand here, because every so often, Chazal tell us that the Rebbeinu Shalom saw that righteous, great people are rare in this world. So it says in the Talmud, God saw to it that he planted every so often in every generation. He didn't put all 500 great men in one generation, right? You'd have an all-star team. What he did is, in this generation he gave you one, and in this generation he gave you one. The Jewish people lived on a few hundred people. The Rambam lists the 80-some people till his time. That was the tradition that brought the Torah to the Jewish people, and we can make a list probably of another 80 people, another 100 people, there's 200 people, 300 people, 500 people. Because they're the ones that got us still here. And if you'll think about it, you'll realize how Judaism therefore emphasizes the individual. And it's true not only in Judaism, if you'll do it in the history of the world, if you'll do it in the history of civilization, of the Western world, I guarantee you won't come up with more than 250, 300 people that have brought us still here. So even though there are billions and billions of people involved, and everybody's important, but there are key people. And the key people are the ones that set up the generation, that set up the direction, that are able, they're the cohesive force that makes it work. So what are the odds of this small man who never went to a yeshiva, who never had a great teacher to publicize him, to push him, who came from one of the smallest, poorest little towns in Lithuania, who never held an official public position in his life? What are the odds of his becoming the leader of the Jewish people? So on an ordinary scale, we would say it's almost impossible. So the chafetz himself is a proof for everything that he stood for. And because basically he stood for the power of the individual, the power of goodness and righteousness, and for the simple faith that a person has to believe that God is dealing with him and with him alone. his son writes about him, and I heard it from my father-in-law as well, and that's well known, that the hallmark of the chafetz chaim was emunah pshuta, simple faith. The chafetz chaim was simplicity itself. He was not, we'll see, he was a very complex person, but you saw from him only simplicity. Simple faith, not philosophy, not fanfare, not people, not general statements on public policy. Absolute simple faith, what an ordinary person would say on the matter. And that was his greatness. That was his greatness. My father told me that once they had to send somebody from the yeshiva to go to collect some money in a town. The chafetz chaim had a son-in-law by the name of Reb Hirsch, Reb Tzvi Levinson, who was also a great zadie. I'll talk about him, God willing, when we get to it. And he died at an early age. The chafetz chaim's life is one tragedy. It's just one tragedy. Mirrored in him is the whole tragedy of that century of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. So the chafetz chaim said, my father-in-law said that they had a meeting, my father-in-law happened to be there for one reason or another. They said, who shall we send? They said, well, we can't send this one because he's got to stay in the yeshiva. And we can't send this one because he's going to St. Petersburg for us. And we can't send this one because, his wife is expecting. We can't send him away. And Rav Hirsch is in Gan Eden. So we can't send him, so this guy wouldn't St. Petersburg, so Rav Hirsch is in Gan Eden, right? It's two places on the map. Just straight. So that was the emunah pshuta, simple faith. But that simple faith is a level that the greatest of people have a hard time reaching, and even if one reaches it, life pushes us off of that pedestal. To be able to retain it for the 90-some years, 93 years, and that it should be genuine, and that it should be transmittable to others, that's the greatness of the chafetz chaim. So he was born in this little town in Shul. Now, his father had married a woman and had two children from his wife, and then his wife died. So his father was a widower, and he married his wife's sister, which was very common among Jews, among European Jews generally, is that if the older sister died, and so they felt that the younger sister would be most compassionate towards her children. The problem always in that type of a relationship is that when a new woman comes in the house, so being a stepchild, in English, if you say someone is a stepchild, so that immediately describes the situation that you're that you're not primary in the family. So in order to avoid the problems of perhaps being a stepchild, the tradition was that they married a sister. So he married the younger sister, and she became the mother of the chafetz chaim. His father was an extremely poor. His father was an extremely poor person in terms of monetary wealth, and in the small town of Shul, there was not unlimited economic opportunity. So he went to Vilna, but he was so poor that he couldn't afford to bring his wife with him. So she stayed in Shul, and he moved to Vilna, and he took the chafetz chaim, he took little Yisroel Meir with him to Vilna. And when he was 10 years old, we find him in Vilna. In Vilna, he studied in a beis medrash under a very famous local Mohammed, Rabbi Yankiv Markover was his name. And the chafetz chaim later said that in that class, there were boys from 10 to bar mitzvah. He said that there was a class of illusion. It was a class of geniuses, many of whom later became great personages, great rabbis. most of whom later continued to Volozhin, to the great yeshiva in Volozhin, which was almost the only game in town. Either you went to Volozhin, the other yeshiva that was available was Mir. Those were the two oldest yeshivas, and at that time, those were practically the only two yeshivas that were in existence. And there was a quota system to get into Volozhin. The quota system was based upon how much money your town contributed to the support of Volozhin, which, from the vantage point of being the financial officer in a yeshiva, I think is eminently fair. And therefore, if you came from small towns, you had very little chance of getting in. You say Zello fair, but that's the way it was. And you have to remember that Volozhin at its zenith had barely over 400 students. So your chances of going away to a big yeshiva in this time, no matter how brilliant you were minimal. And really, that's what made Volozhin so special, because if you got in, so then, that was it. Not only that, but your future was assured. In terms of the rabbinate, in terms of fame, and in terms of the shidduch, Volozhin was the key. And that's why Volozhin, even the greatest revolutionaries came from Volozhin. The greatest secular Jews came from Volozhin. The Chaim never made it to Volozhin, though many of his compatriots did. To further compound the fact, the situation is that his father died when the chafetz Chaim was 13 in Vilna. There was a terrible, the chafetz Chaim was, he wasn't born in 1853, I made a mistake, 1833 is when he was born. 1833 is when the chafetz Chaim was born. Yes. I'm sorry, we got it wrong. 1843 is when he was born. Right. So there's a misprint here. It's 1841 is the date of his birth. 1841 is the date of his birth. He was 93 when he died. He died in 1933. That's correct. 1841 is when he was born. So in 1855, when the chafetz Chaim was barely past bar mitzvah, his father died in Vilna. From 1853 to 1855, there was a terrible cholera outbreak in Vilna. That was the famous story with Rav Yisroel Meir mounting the Dima and allowing the Jews to eat on Yom Kippurim because of the outbreak of cholera. And his father was 46 years old when he died, and now the chafetz Chaim was an orphan. He was an orphan from his father, and he was an orphan from his mother, even though his stepmother, his aunt, he had his mother. Yes, he had his mother. It was his real mother. But he was an orphan from his father, and he was alone in Vilna. All of his life, the chafetz Chaim made a particular effort to deal with orphans and to help them. And he always remarked that he saw in his own life the trauma of being orphaned at an early age, and he therefore went out of his way to try and help orphans. Being an orphan in Eastern Europe was, again, not rare, unfortunately. And there were thousands of Jewish children who were orphans that literally had no place to be. And they slept, the chafetz Chaim would, in Vilna, he slept in the Beis Medrash, he slept in the Shul. And he lived off of the goodness of others who took care of him. But he had no funds, and he had no place to be. He had an older brother, Aaron, who was from his father's first marriage. It was a half-brother. And the older brother, Aaron, lived in Vilna and helped raise him for the next few years. And the chafetz Chaim always mentioned that his older brother, Aaron, the person who had a great influence in his life and who helped him in this terribly difficult, destructive time in his life. His older brother was a businessman, but the chaim continued to study. The chaim had an enormous ability to sit and concentrate for long periods of time, and he was also had a very gifted mind, a very analytical mind. And the brother attempted to do everything in his power to allow the chaim to continue in his studies and to support him, however meagerly, that he would be able to exist. But most of the time, the chaim in Vilna lived in the Beis Medrash, lived in the Shul, and he slept on the bench or underneath the bench. But that also was common. It was not. Unfortunately, it was not an exceptional case. The story that I know, if you remember, the man that lived here in Muncie, we had a grand nephew of the chafetz chaim who lived here. We knew him when he was also in his 90s, almost 80s, 86. He was in his 80s when we knew him, and he once told us he was grand nephew of the chafetz chaim, but his father and mother were assimilated Jews who lived in St. Petersburg already, from the chafetz chaim's own family. And when there was a cholera outbreak in St. Petersburg, and both his father and mother died, and he was left. He was 11 years old, and he was left alone. So they found out that he was related somehow to the chafetz chaim. So the people in St. Petersburg sent him to the chafetz chaim. So here comes this kid, 11 years old, who is taking French lessons and music lessons. And he doesn't wear tzitzit. And he comes to the house of the chafetz chaim. In this little town, he's coming from St. Petersburg to Rad. All right, so it'd be like New York to, I can't describe, what little town often there's a little town off in Ketchikan, Alaska. It's got 40 people in it. That's what it would be like. So he came in, so he told us, the chafetz chaim welcomed him, the chafetz chaim befriended him, and he took him in, and he taught him how to wear tzitzis and everything, but the chafetz chaim hired somebody to give him music lessons and to teach him French, to continue with the French lessons and with the music lessons. So the religious people in town heard that in the chafetz chaim house, they're teaching French, they're teaching secular studies, French, and that they're teaching music. So they came and told the chafetz chaim that it was not proper. That in Radin, in Upper Muncie, it was not proper that, that such behaviors be countenanced. See, I remember he told us that story on a Saturday night. It was one of the most impressive stories I ever heard in my life. That chafetz chaim said to them, he said, "Why does it disturb you if the angels in heaven are smiling?" He said, if you do something on behalf of an orphan and make him feel better and help ease his pain, he said, the angels in heaven are smiling. He said, why does that bother you? So the chafetz chaim always had that attitude towards orphans. By listening to that story, there are many, many lessons that you can learn. So, he was left an orphan, and that made a profound impression upon him. We'll see that many of his habits in life were because of personal experiences that happened to him. His mother, who was now widowed, married a widower, another man who himself was a widower, and they moved to the little town of Radin. And when the chafetz chaim was 17, he returned to Radin to visit his mother. He returned from Vilna to Radin to return to visit his mother. His mother's new husband had a 15-year-old daughter. So they married the chafetz chaim off to her. So he married his stepfather's daughter, which also in Europe, especially among poorer families who could not offer any substantial dowry, was a solution to a problem. Right? His son quotes here that the chafetz chaim said that when his older brother heard that what happened to him, he said, "How could you do that?" He said, "We could have gotten for you a much more favorable match, somebody with a dowry, a person that's such a London as you are, such a great person. Why did you ended up with, The chafetz chaim always said in life, and we'll see that many times, part of his faith was that person never knows what's good for it. God does us favors, and we don't realize it's a favor. So to us it looks like something bad happened, something negative happened. And in reality what happened was an ultimate good, a favor beyond words. The chafetz chaim said to his son, many, many years later, he said, "Look at the favor that the Lord has done to me." Because he said, if it were not for the fact that I lived in this small town, and if it were not for the fact that I had your mother, who supported me all of my life, as we will see, and if it were not for the fact that because of that I was able to live a more tranquil existence and not be involved in the storm of the great city, etc., who knows, he said, if I would have lived so long, and who knows if I would have achieved in Torah what I was able to achieve. And therefore, he said that everything that God does is good. He says that was the good. That he got the simple ship in the small town. That was the best thing that ever happened to him. It's interesting here that his son remarks here also. He said, "I have a great many stories to tell that my mother told me about my father when their first years of marriage, but he said, I will not reveal them. They're too intimate and private, and I will not reveal them." The stepfather of the chafetz chaim, meaning his father-in-law and stepfather at the same time, gave them a house in Rotten. He owned some homes, so he gave them a house in Rotten, and the house was worth 150 ruble, which then was money. And he had promised him another 150 ruble in cash. That was supposed to be the dowry. That was the chafetz chaim's house for the rest of his life. The 150 ruble in cash never showed up. His father-in-law was never able to put the money together, and the chafetz chaim was not anxious to take money or to put pressure. And he therefore returned to Vilna to continue his studies. Now, during this period of time in Jewish life, there were people who were called Prushim. Prushim were young men who got married and then left their wives and went off to study for a certain period of time, sometimes as long as a decade. Had only returned home for the holidays, if at all. And they were called Prushim. You'll go in Eretz Yisrael today, the Yerushalmi Jews call themselves Prushim, right? In fact, the name of one of the families, Purish. Right? The member of Knesset. That's where the name Purish comes from. Because among the Lithuanian Jews, among the disciples of the Cohen of Vilna, that was very common. So he left to go back to Vilna. And he left his wife in Rotten. However, after a few years in Vilna, it was when he was about 20 years old, he suffered from deep depression, mental depression, the chafetz chaim. And for an entire year, he was unable to learn, and he writes that he was even unable to pray correctly. He just couldn't raise himself. And he went to see unless one thinks it's easy to be a tzaddik, right? He went to see the doctors of the time, where you do not know what was prescribed or what was taken, but after a year, he was able to come out of it himself. But the rest of his life, again, this made such a traumatic impression upon him. The rest of his life, he took very good care of his health, and he did not strain himself. He did not. He would not, for instance, learn unlimited hours. But he would say, I can only learn 3 hours, and I'm not going to strain myself. And through this method of self-control and self-discipline, he never had a serious recurrence of that. But he would always warn others whom he thought were abusing their bodies or not careful about their health, or that sat and studied for inordinate amounts of time. So he would say that the body is made to last, he said, 70 years, 80 years, 90 years. He says you have to pace yourself. You have to be able to pace yourself. Something which in youth is very hard to imagine, because when we're young we cannot imagine that we won't have the strength and the power and the stamina that we have when we are young. After this event, and when he recovered, he came home to Rodden, and he stayed in Rodden the rest of his life, except for the times that he went into exile, etc. But his base now was in Rodden. So he really lived in Rodden over 70 years. His wife opened a general store, a small general store. And that was the source of income for the entire family. And he would concentrate on his Torah learning and on his studies. And but every night he helped her with the books. His son writes here in the biography that he remembers from the earliest time that, that after supper, his mother would stay over, what they sold and everything, and his father would write it down in the book. Also, it's a human picture, right? He would write down in the book what they bought, what they sold, what they made, what the charge to take care of that. He doesn't say that his mother couldn't write. He writes his mother was a very clever woman, but it could be that, again, the women of that time did not have a formal education. The chafetz all of his life was raised his wife to the highest pedestal. Here he quotes what his father said. I'm going to read it for you in Yiddish. He said, the little Torah, he said, which I have acquired, I have to thank your mother for it. Because to her, everything was enough. I never had to provide her with anything. Everything she had was enough. She didn't even ask for dry bread, for a crust of bread. She never asked me for clothes. She never asked me to live in a fancy apartment. So he said, everything that I have, I owe to your mother. He writes one more vignette about his mother. It's a very cute vignette that when he was getting married, the son was getting married, so his mother took him to the tailor in town to have a suit made for the chassan. I mean, you couldn't get fat after the wedding because that was your only suit. That was like for 50 years. That was the suit. So you have to, So they made it probably a little big to start with, but that was your suit, right? So they took him to the tailor to have it made, and this tailor was like a well-known person, and it was well-known that the tailor, when he made a suit for a chassan, so he would also throw in a bracha. He would throw in a blessing, So he put the suit on, and that's it. So he said, I wish you that they should wear the suit in good health and hatzlacha with a great deal of success. It is Zaina grace and secher. You should be a big businessman, an osher, and a wealthy person. So he said, my mother became angry at him, and she said, who asked you to give such a bracha? Us, that's not a bracha. So, you can see his mother, right? In that little vignette, you see, this is chafetz, right? He told him, who asked you for such a bracha? In Rodden, the chafetz befriended the lowest class of people, in the idyllic picture that we have of the shtetl, fiddler on the roof, and where never is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. So we have a completely unrealistic picture of what went on there. But the Jewish people were, in Eastern Europe, were very class conscious. And the one class were the Talmidei Chachamim. And then the second class were the wealthier class, the businessmen, the entrepreneurs. And then the middle class, of which there was a very small middle class, were the storekeepers or people who had a trade that required some skill. But the majority of the people in town were unskilled labor. They were teamsters, they were lumbermen, they were porters, they were water carriers, and the upper class, and many times even the Talmidei Chachamim, even the scholarly class, looked down upon them. And there was definitely a class difference. It's not for nothing that that socialism and the labor unions and the Bund were so powerful among the Jewish masses of Eastern Europe. Because the Jewish lower class was exploited. And it was exploited by Jews, not just the general exploitation of the cruelty of the Tsarist government, but it was exploited by Jews as well. The chafetz chaim in Radin, as his first project, when he moved back to Radin, organized classes for the lower class of people. And he was their rebbe. So somebody else would want to be the teacher, to say the highest shir, or to sit and learn with the rabbi, or with the Talmidei Chachamim in town. He organized classes for the lowest classes of people in town. He learned with them chayim, which were basic laws of Jewish behavior that a Jew needed in order to be an observant Jew. He learned with them Ein Yaakov. Shabbos afternoon, he learned with him Chumash and Rashi. Never learned Gemara with him, because that would be on them. And he would also learn with them what today we would call works of Musar, or books of ethics. Sefer Haredim, he learned with them. Sefer Yesod V'Sholosh Avoda, works that would provide inspiration and direction and guidance. And the popularity of the chafetz chaim began with the lower classes, not with the upper. That it is the lower classes that forced the chafetz chaim to greatness and to publicity, because he was their representative. Because of his simple nature, he had no heirs. I mean, I just want to tell you, I saw, like great people, you see an example sometimes. I was here in Montreal. I remember that was the year that I was saying Kaddish and Snuggerah for my mother. So I was in Rabbi Tendler's Shul for Mincha Meir. We didn't have a Shul yet, and I was in Rabbi Tendler's Shul for Mincha Meir. Rabbi Tendler wasn't there, but the Meisha Feinstein's his father-in-law was there for Mincha Meir. And there was a collection of 10, 12, the whole minion was 10, 12 people. And some of the people were just, guys off the street that had to say Kaddish. It was not a major league minion, all right? Except in God's eyes. And when they finished davening mincha, so there was going to be another 10, 15 minutes to daven Meir. So Rabbi Tendler wasn't there. So everybody sat down, was going to start to talk. And Rav Meisha picked himself up, and he opened a chumash, and he taught everybody chumash. He sat for 15 minutes, and he taught everybody chumash. He translated every word by word, in Yiddish. And he said to Rashi, he translated it word by word. With such a simple quality. He wasn't talking down to you, chas v'sholem. But that's just the way it was. Because he also had in himself that grain of greatness. So the great person can deal with children, can deal with the lower classes, he can deal with everybody. The more insecure a person is, then the greater he has to be. People come and tell me, I can only teach the collegiate level. I can only teach in the kollel. I can only have the most. You have to be able to teach Aleph days. You have to be able to teach, sixth grade kids. You have to be able to teach 6-year-old kids. I mean, that's the job of the Jewish people, to be able to teach. But if you set such standards, that's really a drawback in you. He also established for the first time in his town a gemach, a gemilas chasodim, a free loan fund, which he went around and collected money. And he knew the troubles of the poor. And I want to tell you something, you won't believe it, but it's here in his son's book. That every Shabbos afternoon, after the Shabbos meal, the wife of the chafetz chaim went around town and collected the scraps of food that were left from the Shabbos meal on Shabbos, because there was an Erev in town. And she collected the bread and the scraps of food that were left over, and during the week they distributed to the poor in town. So we have heard about people going Erev Shabbos to give people food for Shabbos. But at least in my recollection, first time I hear a story that people went on Shabbos to collect what was left over, right? Let's say you had a half a challah left over, so she came and put the half a challah. And during the week, they gave it to a poorer family in Rodden Tea. And because of this, like, she ran the business herself, this sucker business. So sometimes she borrowed to keep the gemilas chasodim going, and sometimes she borrowed, especially before Pesach, to be able to give to the poor. So again, just to show you an attitude. So when she died, the chafetz chaim put up a sign in the Beis Medrash in Shul, and he said, anyone who my wife borrowed money from should please come and see me so I can pay them off. They were, so in town, amongst the lower classes, they were the ones that needed this tremendous help. I mean, they were the addresses. They were the ones. The Chaim spent a great deal of time in this period of time when he was in his 20s and 30s and even later in isolation and self-meditation. And he kept, the Chaim had a habit that he would talk to himself. And he would talk to himself in third person. He would address himself, Yisroel Meir. And he would, he talked to himself. My father always told me that the Chaim is a Cohen. The Cohen was noted to be someone that had a temper. The Talmud tells us that the Cohen has a temper. So the Chaim had a temper. Which again, how can you say that? But that's the way it was. So he said that when the Chaim would become angry, he would walk away from the person or from the event and go in the corner, and he would talk to himself. And he used to say, Yisroel Meir, everything God. Yisroel Meir, don't become angry. Yisroel Meir, don't become angry. And he would do it long enough until his anger passed, and he would go back to the situation. So he would talk to himself. He was his own governor. And he kept a notebook, a daily notebook of personal problems that he had, of what he achieved, of where he needed improvement. And he used to say, he said that, he told his son, he said, I come home at night, he said, your mother is running an itsy-bitsy little store. And yet for this itsy-bitsy little store, that won't make any difference at all. We keep a full set of books, we mark down everything in the book, and we keep a record. And he said, and for my wife, which is eternity, he says, people don't have a record. People don't keep books. He said, how can that be? So he had a book. He said, right now, I was angry today. I did this today. I improved in that today. I want to try this. And the Bali Nusser always did that. That was one of the hallmarks of the Bali Nusser, is that they wrote down. Well, that was by the tradition, by the way, from the Cohen of Vilna, because the Cohen of Vilna had a book in which he recorded the minutes during the year when he felt he wasted time. And we had it before Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. He had it in the book. We know how many minutes during the year were wasted. Chaim's method of learning Torah, of learning halacha, was, in the words of the Talmud, Lasuke Shmaitza Liba de Hilchim. To learn the Gemara in order to come to the halachic conclusion. Rav Chaim never believed in Pilpulin. He never believed in Chidushei Torah, in saying grand theories in Torah. Rav Chaim, again, that was his simplicity. What's the bottom line? So when he would learn in Indian, he would learn the Gemara, and he would learn Rashi and Tosfos, and then he would learn the Rif, and then he would learn the Rambam. So his comment was that the relationship between the Rif and the Rambam is the relationship between Gemara and Rashi. The Rif is the Gemara, and the Rambam is the Rashi to the Rif. In order to help us understand what the Rif wanted to say, you have to learn the Rambam. And he would study it straight through until he came to the conclusion. And you'll see that in all of his Seferim and halacha, that is the style. That's the goal, that's the thrust, that's the basis, that's the way the book was written. He once told his son that it's a waste of time, he said, to write down your own chidushim, your own ideas in Torah, if they won't ever come to print. He said, if you think that you have a chance to print them, then you should write it down, because then it could benefit, it could be a benefit. But if you know that you're never going to have a chance to have it printed, then he said it's a waste of time, better to sit and learn. And he said, you know how many millions of sheets of paper, he said, with Torah, he said, lie all over Europe that are just gathering moss. So he looked at things differently. I mean, on all of these things, he was a terrible nonconformist, because the position of the yeshivas and the position of the rabbis and the scholars at the time was to commit to writing everything that they did. When he was 30 years old, he left Rodden for a period of 7 months. He traveled to a nearby town of Vasilishak. And in Vasilishak, he began the writing of his first major book called Chaim. It's not clear to us what his motivation was. But basically, the reason for it is attributed to the fact that when the Chaim was 24 years old, in 1865, there was a tremendous machlokas, a tremendous quarrel in Rodden regarding the rabbinate, which I'll discuss with you in the next lecture. But out of that machlokas, out of that dispute, this little town was split in half, and the damage that was done to individuals, and it all stemmed from the fact that people had big mouths, all stemmed from the fact that people said things, and people slandered and lied, and once, I need not tell you that once a machlokas begins, once this type of a vendetta, of a war begins, so then there never is any way to put the genie back in the bottle. There's never any way to straighten it out. And it just feeds off itself. And especially in a little town when there is no other entertainment, and there's nothing else to occupy people's time, so it was not hard to imagine. And this made a tremendous impression on him, as we've seen before. The events of his life made tremendous, and he reacted to it these fashions. And there he had committed himself that he would try in his own way to prevent this from happening in his town, in other towns, and throughout the Jewish world. And he felt the key to that was to write a book, a Shulchan Aruch, a book of laws, limiting a person's speech, teaching a Jew how to speak, especially about the Aveira of Lashon Hara, etc. And he kept that dream, and when he was 30 years old, he began to work on it to see to it that that dream would come to fruition. And this is really what began him on his career and gave him his name. Until then, he was Rav Yisroel Meir, Cohen, kagan. From now on, he'll be known as chafetz chaim. The chafetz chaim, in 1870, traveled from Rodden to Bashishlak and spent 6 months there uninterrupted to work on his Sefer. And there he also began a small yeshiva, as I mentioned. It's interesting that in Rodden itself, the chafetz chaim began a small yeshiva in 1869, where he took in 6 young men, and he had them housed in the community, and people fed them. It was called in Yiddish tag days. Every person was responsible for one day for one yeshiva boy, and they fed them whatever they themselves ate. So to a certain extent, it was the luck of the draw. If you chose wrong, you could have potatoes 6 days in a row, or not even potatoes 6 days in a row. But that system was a very popular system in Eastern Europe, literally till after the First World War. Not to have, they have neither central dormitories, nor do they have central kitchens. Yeshiva only taught, and how one survived at the yeshiva was one's own concern to a great extent, though the yeshiva did provide this system of tag. The chafetz chaim in 1869 began in his small town in Rodden, this yeshiva, which later grew into the famous yeshiva of Rodden. And he taught the boys. He sat and learned with them. However, the yeshiva really did not take off until 1883, when the chafetz chaim